Order. Welcome everyone to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Subcommittee, Environmental Audit Committee, I should say. I'm very pleased to say that this session is going to be looking at the evidence heard by our predecessor committee in the previous Parliament on polar research and British Antarctic. And delighted to be joined by the lead of the Environmental Audit Subcommittee in the last Parliament, James Gray. Mr Gray, thank you very much indeed for coming back to speak to us. I know that the Antarctic is an area you've had tremendous interest in the past. Can you just explain where your interest sort of started and what it was that got you to persuade the previous committee to consider the UK's relationship with Antarctica?
Well, Chair, can I first of all say thank you very much indeed for having me back. I'm delighted that the committee are looking into the report. We did a lot of work on it, and it's useful the work's going to be carried on in the new Parliament. So thank you very much for doing that, and thank you very much for doing me the great honour of asking me back. I tell you, it's pretty frightening being the gamekeeper turned poacher. And so, anyhow, the answer to your question, I think, is well, twofold, really. My own personal interest goes back a long way. I've been involved in both the Arctic and the Antarctic for many, many years, just on a sort of personal basis. The reason for it being that I discovered many years ago that if you're interested in Parliament in education or health or the economy, so is everybody else. And the thing to do is to find a little thing that nobody else knows anything about. And no one else knew anything about the Arctic and the Antarctic, and therefore I was able to make myself a sort of mini expert in it. So that's what I did. The second part of your question, however, is how did I persuade the EAC to take the delegation down to Antarctica and to engage in the inquiry? And that, I think, comes in two parts. The first part is that prior to that, we had done an inquiry into the Arctic, and it only seemed logical then to consider the other half of the equation, which is the Antarctic. But that's of a secondary consideration. The main reason for it is, will not surprise members of this committee, namely that we were exceptionally concerned about climate change and about two things, really. First of all, the effect that was having in Antarctica, the effect on biodiversity, on all the rest of it. But secondly, the effect which a worsening of ice melt in Antarctica, the effect which that would have in the Northern Hemisphere. So we felt it was right, first of all, to go and see what was happening with regard to climate change in the Southern Ocean, and we're pleased not only to be in Antarctica, down the Antarctic Peninsula, but also we had a look at South Georgia and the Falklands, and a little bit in Chile as well. So it's quite a broad spread inquiry. So we were pleased to go and see, what was happening from the point of view of ice melt. I'll come back to that in a moment. But also to see how Britain was contributing to its consideration, and also to see how Britain was contributing to doing something about it. I think simply analysing the fact that we have climate change and the ice is melting is fine, but I think everyone agrees about that. More difficult is to know what we're now going to do about it. And so we were keen to see how Britain was contributing to that. We were proud of the fact that Britain is one of the biggest single contributors to Arctic and Antarctic science in the world. We were proud of the fact that the British Antarctic Survey and NERC, less so NERC, British Antarctic Survey were doing such great work down there, and we wanted to go and see what they were doing. We're proud of the fact that we had the David Attenborough been launched and was now down there, and we were given the opportunity of flying to Falklands, going round South Georgia on an RAF plane, then getting on to the SDA, as we call it, David Attenborough, travelling down to the Antarctic Peninsula, visiting the much improved scientific research base Rothera, which is down towards halfway down the peninsula, and seeing the work which British Antarctic Survey do. We also chanced to go and visit HMS Protector, who happened to be there at the same time. So we went and saw what the HMS Protector were doing, and then came back out via Chile to have a word with the Chilean government and their great concerns about Antarctica. So it was seeing what's happening there, but B, seeing what we are doing about it and seeing what contribution we were making to it.
Excellent, thank you. Well, on that subject, Julia Buckley, if I can bring you in.
Thank you. So could you share with the committee, please, what were your key takeaways from the committee's visit to the Rothera research station?
Well, there are several. I mean, it's a very broad question, and I don't mean to talk too much and therefore prevent you all from having proper questions, but there's a broad question. The first thing is, both through our visit to Rothera and our trip on the SDA and our visit to Cambridge, to British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, and in the evidence sessions that we held here, we were enormously impressed by the expertise of all of the scientists, and particularly the British Antarctic Survey, who I know you're seeing later on today, and the fantastic work which they do. We are lucky. It's absolutely outstanding capability, which we have, the Americans have, one, two other people do. But I mean, it's a world-beating capability, and we're enormously proud of that. And I think that our visit reconfirmed that. We're both seeing the work that will be done in Rothera. Rothera is halfway through being restored, or not restored, rebuilt. And right now, there wasn't that much going on in terms of science, but we could see that as soon as that work was completed, there would be an outstanding contribution to science at Rothera. And we just, so that's the first thing. Item one was, we were impressed by what we saw. Item two was, what I'd say, we were depressed by what we saw in terms of climate change. I was very struck, for example, by flying with the RAF from the Falklands around South Georgia. And I was on South Georgia on a visit about 5-10 years ago. Absolutely ice-free zone, because South Georgia is in a slightly warmer bit of the Southern Ocean, and there was no ice there at all. Flying around last April, there were huge icebergs, these megabergs that had broken off from Antarctica, one of them just about the same size as the island of South Georgia itself, an absolutely gigantic piece of ice. And this can't be right. I mean, there must have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of icebergs off South Georgia. And the same applied down in we went down through the, I've forgotten the name of the strait, it was bad to me, but anyhow, the strait that goes down the inside of the peninsula to get you down to Rothera, again, ice-free. And we could see, looking up at the mountains on either side of the glaciers, that they had been much, much more icy, but the ice is now disappearing. And talking to the scientists we met down there and to people from BAS and from other organisations, they were able to describe to us some really shocking evidence of climate change and the effect on the ice in Antarctica. Third, I think, was, and it's consequential if you like, the effect that that's having on biodiversity and on animal life and on the emperor penguin is the one that always catches the news, but all of the animal life and sea life in the South Atlantic, Southern Ocean, was pretty dramatic. So those are the kind of three positive takeaways. I want to, here I'm at risk of upsetting my friends in the British Antarctic Survey, I want to also raise with you a little question mark, which I think is worth asking, which is to say, we are, the EAC report into the Arctic came to the conclusion that we're spending really very, not little, but comparatively little money in the Arctic, on Arctic science, compared to an enormous amount of money in Antarctica. Now, there are very good reasons for doing that. I'm sure you'll quiz Dame Jane later on this subject, but the fact is that we are only 400 miles away from the Arctic. We're 10,000 miles or something away from Antarctica, but we spend a vast amount of money in Antarctica. Linked to that, and the reason which I suppose the Foreign Office would give you would be, well, we have a big geopolitical interest in the Southern Ocean. So we have the Falklands, and we have South Georgia, and we have the Antarctic Treaty System, and CAMLAR, and all that. And it's very, very important that we should be there and flying the flag, and we use science as a way of flying the flag. Well, I just sort of slightly raise an eyebrow and say, well, is funding that goes down through UKRI, through NERC to BAS, and is then used for the SDA and for Rothera, is that really the best way of Britain flying the flag? If BAS's job is to do science, and it does an absolutely outstanding job of doing it, to what degree can they justify spending money on the infrastructure? So I think there's a sort of...
I think we will cover these issues when we get a chance to speak to them. Did you want another?
Just to follow up, if we could, quite briefly. So how did the experience shape your understanding of the logistical and scientific challenges that were faced by BAS?
Well, you can't know what's happening unless you go there. And so we were very keen to go there. The committee were very keen to go there. And, of course, the logistic challenges are enormous. I mean, just getting there and flying to the Falklands is of itself quite tricky, but then getting from the Falklands down to Rothera was a major operational difficulty. And we were very lucky that BAS found some slots for us on the SDA. But I mean, we're also lucky that we crossed the Southern Ocean fairly flat, fairly calm. But actually, it isn't normally. It's normally one of the wildest seas in the world. And of course, you can't really fly there at the moment because the runway at Rothera is closed. So the logistical challenges are huge. The logistical challenges for science are huge. I mean, most scientists sitting in a lab in Cambridge, have a nice time. But if you're out there, we went out on a skidoo device to go and see some of them. If you're down there, out in the minus 20, minus 30, and huge winds, I mean, it's seriously difficult thing to do. So the logistical challenges of doing science down there are extremely high. That is why it is that we're so pleased that we're doing this rebuilding of the infrastructure in Antarctica to take account of that. So it's worth doing. It's good stuff, but I'm just slightly questioning about the way in which it's funded.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna Gelderd.
Thank you. And based on your observations during the inquiry, where do you believe government action is most urgently required? And firstly, to ensure that climate change, biodiversity threats, fishing and tourism are given sufficient consideration under the Antarctic Treaty System.
First of all, the ATS system is superb, and our contribution to it is brilliant. We're actually with Jane Rumble from the Foreign Office, who's actually with us on the trip. And she's the commissioner, I think I'm right in saying, if that's the right expression, in charge of ATS. And we punch above our weight on the Antarctic Treaty System and on CAMLAR. I mean, CAMLAR is a very complicated organisation because it operates on unanimity. And getting the Russians and the Chinese and even the Norwegians to agree with us on anything to do with fisheries is really quite tricky. So I think what we do in ATS and CAMLAR and what we do with regard to flying the flag is extremely successful. I think we should be proud of it, and it really is an important thing that Britain PLC does, and we do it exceptionally well. The second part of your question has just slipped my mind.
It's just, basically where is required action most urgent, and the topics of climate change, threats to biodiversity, fishing and tourism. And then I was going to follow up with a second question about providing effective support for UK scientific research on the continent.
Okay. With regard to the first part of that, we have been the lead in the COP process, and quite right that we should be. However, recent experience wasn't encouraging, to say the least. By far our first duty must be to fight the battle against climate change and in favour of net zero by 2050. I mean, that has to be what we're about, and presumably this committee is very committed to that, and we mustn't let that slip. And I sometimes get worried when you look at America and President Trump arriving, or even in this country, one or two political parties. They take the view climate change doesn't exist, or if it does exist, we can't do anything about it, or if we can do anything about it, it's too expensive. We've got to fight against that kind of easy truism. It's not true, it's wrong. And what we saw with regard to the environment in Antarctica, it will get worse, and it will get a heck of a lot worse, unless we do something about it. The first thing has to be CO2 and indeed methane as well. Come to that. The second thing, however, I think is we just need to think carefully about how we target our money. We are spending a lot of money on science. I'm glad that we are, and it's very money extremely well spent. But I think we're possibly coming to a stage where analysing, I said a moment ago, analysing whether climate change is happening or not, or even analysing how bad climate change might be, is kind of historical. We're all agreed on that front. That's kind of dealt with. I'd much rather see a lot more money, a lot more effort and energy spent on considering what the world can do about it as part of the COP process, but also in lots of other ways. For example, there's very little coordination, more to do with the Arctic than the Antarctic, very little coordination amongst the 70-odd universities in Britain who have some form of Arctic scientific department. And they don't know what they do, but at least theoretically they don't know what each other are doing. So I think much more coordination, much more big science. I mean, Dame Jane, who we'll be seeing later on, is a very great advocate for big science. We can't do things in Little Britain. Let's do more with America, and there have been a couple of very successful transnational operations that we've done with America and indeed with others. And I think much more of that needs to be done. We need to find a way of spreading the burden across and persuading other people to step up to the plate and do their bit.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And to follow up on that, where would you see the most urgent action needed to provide effective support for the UK scientific research on the continent?
Well, it doesn't do to be complacent, but I think that everyone would agree with me probably that the money which we spent in building the Sedate Attenborough and in the Rothera upgrade has been a lot of money well spent by UK PLC, and I think just asking for more money all the time might not be the right thing to do. There is a debate to be had, which we had, and again you must ask others about this, but they've gone down from 2 ships down to 1 ship, and there was great debate as to whether or not the Sedate Attenborough alone is enough of a ship. And a lot of people thought we ought to perhaps charter a second ship to carry out the logistical and carrying stuff around from the Falklands to South Georgia to Antarctica, while the SDA therefore could focus on science, which is what she's built for, £250 million or something. So there is some discussion to be had about that. I think that the answer you'll get from the Treasury will be there ain't no money, and therefore don't waste time asking for a new ship. But I mean, nonetheless, that doesn't stop us thinking that might be a good thing to do. I do think also, and again, I'm a bit of a controversialist, and I like stirring things up a little bit. I do kind of slightly wonder whether or not the science needs to be done down there. Science nowadays is all about data, it's all about big data. And of course we have to people on the ground, we have to people in the field, but actually could not more be done in labs in the UK, therefore less being spent on getting people there. And equally, there's a slightly third thing on this front, which is that all the money now is being spent on climate change science. That's the sexy beast, and if you're a climate change scientist, you get the grants. But if you're an old-fashioned bioscientist looking at fisheries and things, you find yourself being slightly kind of left behind. Or that was what we were certainly told by a number of people we met when we were down there. And I think we need to think about that. You can only look at emperor penguins when you're there. Or largely, you can do a bit by video, but you can do, and so need to possibly think about the split between bioscience and climate change science.
Thank you. Cameron Thomas.
Is there any other key evidence that you'd like the committee to consider beyond the scope of that?
I think it depends how fundamental you want to be. I mean, I think I would differ from other people in this, which is to say, my own personal view, and I want to declare an interest. I'm halfway through writing a book about the Arctic.
Sorry, can you just say the questions about the evidence we need to look at rather than your view, if you don't mind, on this one? So particular evidence you want to make sure we haven't missed that you heard in the work that you did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard to list that without putting one's own opinion into it, but it seems to me that the evidence we received was an enormous amount of money is being spent in Antarctica on science, and particularly on the infrastructure supporting science, whereas a relatively small amount of money is being spent in the Arctic, and therefore maybe we ought to think carefully about how UK PLC is carrying out Arctic-type science.
Thank you. I think you've made that point strongly. We obviously will be speaking to ministers later in this session. You have made the point about the funding, which we may well consider. You said at the start of your evidence that part of the question here to what's government actually going to do about it. I mean, is there anything specifically that you think now we've got a new government in place we should be expecting ministers to do as opposed to what we found?
I would say that ministers probably, their hearts are in the right place. I had the good fortune of being at the Arctic Circle Conference with Minister Doughty earlier on, about a month ago, and he really is committed to this cause. I do think, and this is a machinery of government question rather than anything else, I do think that the complicated structure which goes from the department through UKRI, through NERC and down to BAS is a complicated structure, and I'm not quite sure how Parliament really would scrutinise that. It's hard to know who's spending what money where and on what. And it may be a PAC question because it's, does BAS at the bottom of the heap, does BAS get the right money? And where's the money that's up here from the department actually go to? There are 3,000 civil servants currently in the up here, and Spry. Anyhow, but in terms of, I've thought steady as she goes by and large the Guardian ministers. I mean, we aren't going to change the environment overnight. I think Britain does punch above our weight in it, and I'm glad that the government made a good contribution to the COP process last month. Keep it up and hold their toes to the fire, and be ready to make sacrifices in this country. I mean, we have to lead by example. It's no good us saying that we're only 1% of the world and therefore we can't do it. We've got to lead by example and do stuff here, and ministers have to be robust. And if that means putting petrol prices up or putting gas prices up or things that might be unpopular, maybe you have to do that in order to achieve net zero. So be tough and robust.
I'm tempted to say that sounds like the sort of thing someone would say who just lost an election, but anyway, I won't be so unkind. Eric Gardner.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with you being tough and robust, Mr. Gray. Look, I just wanted to explore some of the things that you've said, because on the one hand you say we're doing world-class science here, but then you say, but really that's all historic and we should just be focusing what to do about it. And you say, actually, there's enough money here, but maybe we should be spending more on an extra ship. And it seems to me that there are real contradictions in the evidence that you're giving to the committee. Because you clearly, and I know from our time together on the committee, how passionate you are about the Antarctic. But I just think I want to get you to give us a clear line here. The work that's being done in the Antarctic is important. You don't just stop science because actually you say, well, we now know that we've got a lot of other things to do that results from that science. You keep on going with the science, don't you? And the key thing here is how can we influence the way in which that science helps us tackle the problem? And I think that does come to the question that my colleague asked you about the Antarctic Treaty System and how we can best influence that. So can I ask you to sort of focus along that line?
Well, first of all, I think I'd plead guilty in the sense that I want everything. And if we can have a second ship and 500 scientists at Rothera, and let's go for it. I know we can't. So I plead guilty to your allegation that my evidence is kind of split. My personality is slightly split in the matter. We cannot lose sight of all of the bureaucracy and the structures and the internal matters must not allow us to lose sight of the fact that the ice is melting at an alarming rate in both ends of the world, and that's having a significant effect on wildlife and fisheries and biodiversity in every way. And all of these discussions about is BAS better to do it, or should somebody else be doing something, or all those things must not obscure that central truth. The Antarctic Treaty System is important in the sense that it prevents the use of Antarctica for anything other than science, although whether all of the signatories are being quite as robust in that front as we are, I wasn't able to visit I think it's 9 Chinese bases there are currently, or some such number, in Antarctica. So, but the treaty system works well. There are interesting questions, one of which we discussed quite a bit when we were down there, which is supposing you pick up one tiny pebble, let's say, or sometime little piece of germ, and you then use that here for commercial purposes to build a new medicine preventing cancer. Is that doable? Are you allowed to do that? And to what degree can you export the science which you find in Antarctica? There are things of that kind which the Antarctic Treaty System can address itself to. One of the things that slightly worries me, one of the reasons why I'm very delighted that the committee are doing the work which you're doing, is that the whole question of Antarctica and the Arctic is a very small little world. And a number of us have been much involved for donkey's years and know a little bit about it. And I'm busy writing a book about it, and all that's great stuff. But the wider world doesn't. And if you spoke to most people in this building and said, what do you think about Antarctica? They'd go, is that polar bears? Do you know what I mean? I think that it's a remarkable lack of interest and understanding amongst the population. And therefore, I think one job which we as politicians, or you as politicians, can do is get that message over to the wider world that something really bad is happening here, really, really, really bad is happening here in Antarctica. And if we keep going the way we're going at the moment, it's going to be a catastrophe.
And if you were still chairing the subcommittee, what would the one recommendation that you would insist was in our report?
I think that's a rather difficult question to answer, Mr. Gardner. I think, I think the report, if I was still chairing it, would be overwhelmingly positive and say we are doing great stuff, but be ready to ask some very difficult questions indeed about some of these structural questions that I mentioned, because if we're trying to produce first-class science, if we're trying to win the battle over climate change, you can't do it if you've got the wrong structure. So you have to have some of those kind of structural things and funding things and so on and so forth are questions that should be asked. I think the committee might have a role to play in asking. But I think by and large, our overall impression, I speak really for the other people who are on the subcommittee as well, our overall impression is one of being hugely impressed. I mean, it's great work that's being done. And we're punching above our weight as a nation. It's fantastic we are. We should be proud of that, and that's the main story, and that the really serious things that are happening, only by doing that can we have some effect on that. But there are things in the short grass that perhaps that might need teasing out a little bit, and I hope that your inquiries will result in some of those things becoming.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gray, for coming back. We very much appreciate the evidence that we've heard, and thank you also for the work substantial amount of work you put into this inquiry in the last Parliament. Thank you. Indeed, order. The sitting is suspended. We are joined for the second panel today by Professor Jane Francis and by Dr. Iain Williams. Could I invite you first, please, just to introduce yourself and your organisations, please?
Thank you. I'm Jane Francis. I'm Director of the British Antarctic Survey.
Good afternoon. Iain Williams. I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Natural Environment Research Council, part of UKRI.
Excellent. Well, thank you, both of you, for your assistance today. Dame Francis, if I may start with you, what are the most significant climate and environmental changes that are currently occurring in Antarctica?
Yeah, thank you. If you asked me that question about 5 years ago about Antarctica, I would have said Antarctica is a big chunk of rock on a big chunk of ice, and the word that all the scientists were using was inertia, that it was so big and so cold in the southern position that nothing much was happening in climate change. I am absolutely going to completely dispel that now. For the last couple of years, we have seen phenomenal changes in Antarctica. And the really important thing about what's happening in Antarctica, it doesn't stay in Antarctica, it is changing the whole world. It has a global impact because of the scale of it. So there are about 5 things that are happening now that we're really focusing on in the science, not just the UK, but the whole of the Antarctic science community. First of all, the ice shelves are melting. So glaciers are on land, the streams of ice, they come down and then they float on the ocean and they fringe the whole of the Antarctic continent. And the really important thing about those ice shelves are that they keep the glaciers back on land, and it's the glacier ice that is causing sea level rise. So the ice shelves are the buttresses that keep the ice back on land. And those ice shelves we know now are that we're doing a lot of science on, are beginning to melt from below, not from above, but from below. And there was a big project that the UK was involved in called the Thwaites Glacier Project. It's one of the glaciers that we saw from satellite images, which was thinning quite rapidly. So that was a joint collaboration with the US, UK, Germany, Sweden and Korea. And we worked together to really do some really frontier science, looking at what was happening underneath the ice shelf to understand what was happening. That now is being repeated, that kind of science, around the whole of Antarctica by different nations, because this is really quite critical. We could melt some of the big ice sheets very quickly if with that under water heating, melting. And the challenge is to find out when that will happen and how fast that will happen and what the global impact will be. If all the ice on Antarctica melted, there would be about a 65-metre sea level rise, which would drown this building completely, and all the ice on the planet would go. Antarctica holds about 90% of the world's fresh water, so I mean it's a big chunk of ice. So the ice is melting from above. The other thing that's happening, and has been happening the last couple of years, we've noticed, through long-term monitoring is really important in Antarctica to understand what the variability is. But the last couple of years, we have seen the sea ice around Antarctica has beginning to shrink. So the sea ice forms every winter when it gets cold and dark, and it forms almost doubles the size of the continent. And that sea ice is really quite critical. It's a home where the emperor penguins breed on the edge of this sea ice. But underneath the sea ice, there's a whole ecosystem. There's sea ice algae. There are krill that live on these algae, so they have a kind of nursery area underneath the sea ice. The sea ice also keeps the cold in the ocean. It acts as a blanket, and it stops the storms reaching the ice shelves. And that's beginning to shrink. So that's really concerning a lot of us about what is happening there. And again, that fundamentally influences climate and oceanography and what's happening in the oceans, which again affects the whole planet. The other thing that's happening is in the ocean. So the ocean around Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, is really, really important to the rest of the planet. It's the biggest and deepest ocean on the planet. And all the man-made heat and carbon that we're generating is going into the ocean. A lot of it, 90% of it, is going into the ocean. And at least half of that is going into the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. So the heat is being taken down. And there are some estimates that about 36 degrees worth of heat, of man-made heat, is being stored in the ocean around Antarctica. And one of the things that we are looking at is where is that heat going deep into that ocean? And how stable is it? Because you can imagine if the ocean suddenly overturns and that heat comes up again, that is really going to, accelerate our warming. Carbon is also being buried into the ocean and buried in deep, deep layers of the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. And we're really concerned that is changing. So what we're seeing is that the surface of the ocean around Antarctica is becoming much fresher because a lot of ice is melting in Antarctica. And that ocean and Antarctica plays a really critical role in the ocean circulation across the whole planet. So cold, deep, salty, dense water comes from the Antarctic continent. It slides right off the continent, deep into the ocean, and then it flows all the way through across the equator up to the northern hemisphere. And then it starts circulation, the ocean circulation. So it has a fundamental impact on the whole ocean circulation. And what we're really worried about is the melting of the ice in Antarctica is freshening the surface, so there's fresher water, it's changing the density of the water, and it will change ocean circulation radically. And that will affect us all in terms of how that affects the climate.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's an incredibly detailed answer to the question and covered sort of several of the questions that we've got. Could I just invite you to touch a little further on the ocean currents that you just mentioned there at the end? What is our best knowledge as to what the impact of those potential changes in the ocean currents might be to us and to the wider world?
Well, the ocean, it will affect the ocean. It affects our climate. So the ocean is one of our climate drivers, and so there is a whole magnitude of influences across the whole term. Also, if the ocean is less strong, there is a possibility that it starts changing some of the currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, as you may know about, and whether that will weaken the Gulf Stream, which will change the climate in the Arctic regions and around Europe. So the whole scientific questions are actually linked across the whole planet. You can't really... And of course, as the ice melts, sea level will rise, and that will affect everybody on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously explained that this is, substantially worse over the course of the last couple of years. I mean, given that some of that melting is already irreversible due to past carbon emissions, what are the projected long-term impacts on the UK of further melting? And what do you expect that we will see here from what has already happened?
Well, the ice is melting, so sea level is going up, 4 millimetres a year. A component of that is from the Antarctic ice sheets. And so that's been continuing, and that is now becoming more cumulative, and it probably will accelerate into the future. So that means all the coastal areas, not just around the UK, but around the whole world, will be impacted. But what's happening in Antarctica will affect the climate across the whole world, and that will affect the UK as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, is there anything you wanted to add on that, Dr. Williams?
No, I don't think so. That's very thorough.
Very good analysis, thank you. Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that some of the impact that climate change is going to have on biodiversity in Antarctica. I read recently that avian influenza has also been sort of transferred to Antarctica. What are your thoughts on the implications for biodiversity of that and the stability of Antarctic ecosystems, particularly for vulnerable species?
So at the moment, there is some avian flu in Antarctica, particularly in the sub-Antarctic islands. It's pretty bad, I think, in the Falklands. But we have an island, a station called Bird Island, which is near South Georgia. There has been some, but not on Bird Island. But on South Georgia, in our station there, we have a specialist team that is doing specialist research on bird flu and genetic sequences, and they are specifically looking and watching very carefully at what's happening there. So far, the avian flu has not really taken hold very badly on that island. On the Antarctic Peninsula going south, we now know that there are some reports of avian flu there, and we do expect that it will just naturally, through bird contact, be seen further down the peninsula. So in our Rotherham station, which is further south, we're very conscious of biosecurity. We take this very seriously with all the people that we take to Antarctica. And in Rotherham, the instructions are very clear. Nobody is to touch any dead animals or birds. And there are specialist teams that are trained to deal with avian flu, and they would be the people that deal with any dead animals or birds with special protective gear.
Thank you. I've got quite a personal connection to the Falkland Islands. Can you tell me what activities is going on there? I seem to remember being taken on various tours in the armed forces to the outlying island. That could potentially have a significant impact on some of the penguin species. Do you know what activities is being undertaken in the Falkland Islands?
Not specifically, no. I do know that there is quite a lot of avian flu, or there has been avian flu on the Falklands, and that came across. There was definitely a movement coming down South America and across to the Falklands, but I'm not sure how they're handling it now.
Certainly. Oh, thank you. What steps ought to be taken to protect species from the spread of avian flu?
Well, as I said, we take biosecurity very seriously. So anybody that goes to Antarctica is giving a lot of training in biosecurity. We make sure that we've got special facilities in Cambridge and in the stations to make sure that everything is checked. We make sure that people, don't take muddy boots into Antarctica. They don't take, particularly seeds and anything that is literally alien into Antarctica as much as we can possibly manage.
It sounds like it might be quite difficult to manage given the increasing tourism that takes place in Antarctica.
Well, some of the Antarctic ships are very good at biosecurity, and they do take care about how their passengers behave and make sure that they clean their boots and they really look after where they go. But yeah, I think that bird flu will be transmitted from bird to bird. it will be quite difficult to stop.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Pippa Halings.
Thank you. And picking up on that issue where we've got, I can understand, just increased vulnerability of species, as was being mentioned there. Biosecurity is one. The other is about the role of marine protected areas within that. Would you say that we have sufficient research to establish the marine protected areas necessary now to just give that greater resilience, not just from avian flu, but from all of the other impacts? You mentioned krill and fishing and whatever. Do we have sufficient grounds for being able to define and establish those marine protected areas?
So that's a question you should ask Jane Rumble when she comes from the Foreign Office, because that's her territory dealing with CAMLR, the marine living resources. But we have scientists in the British Antarctic Survey that work specifically on looking at things like fish stocks, breeding areas, nursery areas, and they go to the CAMLR meetings with Jane Rumble to add the scientific evidence to where fishing should take place or where it can take place, what the stock levels are, and the areas that we need to preserve. So yes, we do the research that looks at sort of, if you like, the more pure research that looks at the ecosystems and the food chains and how climate change is affecting the whole ecosystem in Antarctica. But then there's specific work that goes on to look at fish and the fishing industry and the resources that are required there.
Can I ask a follow-up question just on that?
Briefly.
So we've heard just from the previous speaker, Mr. Gray, that perhaps this is work that could be done in Cambridge at BAS. Would you like to have the chance to say whether that actually some of this needs to be done in situ?
I don't think we know how climate change is happening, and I don't think we should stop our work on climate change. I will say, though, that we collect huge amounts of data, and so we can do a lot of work in Cambridge on that data, we do collect data in different ways now. So we use satellite information, a huge amount of satellite information. We use autonomous vehicles, so we set off from the ships to collect data. So data is our rich source of information, which goes into computer models that does future forecasting that then can help policy. So that's the link. But we still need to make these measurements. We still need to monitor. And if we don't particularly do long-term monitoring, we won't know where the changes are and what has changed.
Thank you. Marketing Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Jane, what's your assessment of how well positioned the UK is to meet its scientific priorities in Antarctica? And does the British Antarctic Survey have the necessary resources, staffing, infrastructure to support those priorities?
Well, I'd always say we'd like more money, wouldn't we? But so we have an MOU with DCMG, FCDO, the government, basically, to say the two missions to do world-class science and to support the presence of UK in Antarctica. So that means UK scientists. That's what we do with our logistics. We support UK science. In terms of world-class science, I think the UK is a leader, particularly an influential leader in Antarctic science. If you like, the data shows that we produce the second highest number of papers. The US is the number one because they have far more scientists that go to Antarctica than we have. But we have a huge influence on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change reports. We have a lot of what they call authors and lead authors in IPCC. We are a partner of choice for many scientific collaborations. Certainly in the Antarctic Treaty, Jane Rumble is one of the most respected voices in the treaty at the geopolitical level. So I think we have a leadership position that we are working very hard to maintain.
Thank you. In terms of now moving into the summer research season, what are the current key projects? And I suppose just reflecting in terms of developments, the committee's be made aware of since evidence was last taken.
So those are the topics that I mentioned just now are really new, and so we are beginning to do research in all those topics. We have a major topic which all the research centres of NERC are involved in called Biopole, and that is looking at how melting ice is taking nutrients from the land, from the ice into the ocean, and how that's changing. So as the ice melts and as there are more meltwater and climate changes and the ocean is is warming. There are huge, phenomenal changes in ocean circulation, in the ecosystems that live in the ocean. And so we are using the ship, which is doing absolutely fantastic science, and using the ship to look at how the ocean is changing, responding to climate change.
Thank you. And Dr. Williams, in terms of what specific actions is NERC taking to prioritise international research collaboration that will strengthen our understanding in terms of climate systems, ecosystems?
Maybe just take a step back a moment and talk about the research funding and how it all flows through, because that sort of part answer is also part of the question, your previous question as well. NERC funding covers across all environmental sciences, budget around £330 million a year. That is split between our NERC centres, of which British Antarctic Survey is one, to do long-term big science and a lot of the long-term monitoring activities as well. There's also providing infrastructures. And then the 60% is competitively let, and any university research institute can apply for that. BAS wins a good number of programs, but also a lot of universities, particularly in the Antarctic, University of East Anglia, Leeds, Southampton, Cambridge, are the top universities there. So driving research, if you like, bottom up through curiosity-led research. So that's drives a lot of our research programs as well. Specifically about international programs and what we're doing. We work closely with our funding council partners across the world. We always looking to develop agreements, sometimes MOUs, which are called lead partner agreements. And these are really important because if we're talking about competitively funded research, which is peer-reviewed and goes through the process, there's a risk with international research that it has this double jeopardy. So it has to be approved in the UK, and if you're partnering with somebody in the US, it has to be approved by US authorities. So we have agreements where it only has to go through that process once, and we agree that the equivalent processes are equivalent to ours. So our agreement with the National Science Foundation in the US is probably our strongest in that area. Over the last 8 years, we've funded 19 different projects, £4.5 million, leveraging about $12 million from the US in those. So it's a really good way of working and facilitating researchers to work internationally. We also have a call out at the moment called the Global Seed Corn Partnerships call, which enables or really facilitates researchers to develop new partnerships with new partners and develop some funding for that to again help encourage the right environment for international research.
And on that question of collaboration, then obviously there are some financial benefits to collaboration, but what you're saying is there's also scientific benefits to collaboration.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah, very definitely.
In terms of looking to, in particular, the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernisation Programme, in terms of going into the details of this, in terms of what are the key strategic objectives of that programme?
So the key objectives are really around advancing our scientific capabilities and enabling the science to be undertaken in the Antarctic. Continue to advance and improve on safety is very important. And reducing our environmental footprint in the Antarctic, reducing our carbon emissions and through all sorts of ways to improve the facilities in that way. So they're the sort of three main primary objectives.
Dame Jane, Mr. Gray mentioned his earlier evidence about the work going on at the Rotherham Research Station. When is that work expected to be completed?
So at the moment, what we're doing there mainly is to build a new science support centre. So it's all about modernisation. Some of the buildings in Rotherham are built in the 70s and 80s and built of wood, and they're not insulated. So safety is my top word. So we're building very safe buildings now. So the Discovery building will be finished this season. So in March 25, it will be technically handed over from the construction teams to the BAS teams to run it, and then there will be another season when we work together to make sure it all works, all the snags are found and it works properly, and then it will be officially sort of opened, if you like. Yeah.
And in terms of that new building, how will it add to the research capabilities?
Well, it's a really new state-of-the-art modern building, so it supports science, but it also supports all the functions and supporting science that goes in there. So this is where scientists go. If they're going into the field in Antarctica, they will come here first and spend some time to prepare all their field camps and all the things they need for safety in the field. And then there are offices there for science as well. But there's also the medical centre, so we have phenomenal new telemedicine. So this is where you wear goggles. A doctor can wear goggles and talk to a doctor back in our centre in Plymouth. And we have sort of much more efficient energy resources. So this comes with a renewable energy package as well. So we're looking at, the whole building is coated in solar panels. It only works for 6 months of the year, and then it goes dark. And we're looking at other different kinds of energy, and just to make being in Antarctica much more greener and as safe as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah Gibson.
Thank you. James mentioned earlier that he felt that perhaps, in his slightly more conflicted views on it, but that perhaps there was too much money, as James suggested, compared with the Arctic. How do you feel the balance between Antarctic research? Sorry.
Yeah. So I'll pick up that. As far as competitive research, so the research that is funded by open competition with universities and research institutes competing for that, actually over a long period of time, the number of grants and the amount of funding between the Arctic and the Antarctic is very, very similar. And there's been very little trend to say that it's been going up or down in either of those locations. So in terms of competitive research, there's very, very little difference. The difference applies obviously with the infrastructure costs. Undertaking research in the Antarctic is more expensive, of course, and some of the longer-term programs which we fund at the British Antarctic Survey, Jay mentioned earlier, to support the long-term observations and big science to understand what's happening in the Antarctic. I would just say, if I may sorry, Jane, you have to be careful as well that we don't focus too much in some respects, with all due respect, on the British Antarctic Survey and the Sir David Attenborough when we talk about Antarctic research. NERC owns, operated by National Oceanography Centre, 2 other ocean-going research vessels, RSS Discovery and RSS James Cook, which are not ice-strengthened but do go into the Arctic when it's free of ice, and do a lot of research through those methods as well.
And I just want to say that also we do work in the Arctic, not just BAS, but UK universities as well. We've just come back from a northern summer working on taking the first trip of the Sir David Attenborough ship into Greenland to look at the glacier melting Greenland. And this is the first time the ship's gone there, only this sort of second season when the ship's been used for science, and it was phenomenally successful, and the scientists were absolutely raving about it because the full capabilities of the ship were being used. We've got state-of-the-art labs on there. It's like if you know the Crick building in London, it's like the Crick on the ship. Phenomenal laboratories. We had helicopters that were taking people to do geology and research on the land, and then we had small boats out looking at the ocean as well. So it was like 3 or 4 or 5 projects in one on the ship, and it was incredibly successful. And we're going to follow that up because there's a new funding source called ARIA, a new government source of funding, and we're really well into working with ARIA to do another Greenland trip to look at tipping points in the Arctic.
I just ask a quick question
sure.
on that. One of them is that James mentioned also the distance. Is the distance between us going to the Arctic opposed to us going to the Antarctic a really serious additional cost? And also the next question was quickly just when was that ship likely to go north again?
Do you want to do them?
So I'll pick up the second part first, if I may. So the Sir David Attenborough does not have a schedule to be in the Arctic Ocean planned at the moment. We do publish. We recently published when all our marine infrastructures are available for use. There is available for use in the 26 summer, in the Arctic summer in 26. So as I was referring to competitively let funding, we have calls open at the moment called Pushing the Frontiers call, for example, where the research community can bid into proposals. They know, because we publish it, what capabilities are available for use in what time windows. So there is opportunity there, and we look forward to seeing the research proposals from the community.
In terms of that question about distance, it doesn't really matter, because what the ship normally does, it starts off from Harwich, which is its dock in November. It left October, goes to Antarctica, does the summer season in the Antarctic. Then it comes back to the UK. Then it does its servicing, has MOT if you like, for a week or two, and then it's got the summer. There's the northern summertime to work in the Arctic, and then it comes back and it goes south again. So they're two different time windows, really. So there's plenty of time to do both polls.
Thank you very much. Julia Buckley.
Thank you. I did want to ask you exactly about the ship, and I'm really pleased to hear some of those details coming forward. So our question was going to be when the Sir David Attenborough will return to the north, but you seem to imply that would depend on funding. Have I understood that correctly?
When it does, it will return to the Northern Hemisphere on its servicing schedule, if you like, and refit schedule. When it does research activity in the north, that'll depend on the research grants that are proposed and are funded.
The sort of individual applications,
yes.
Piece by piece. So if
yes.
none come forward, it won't be doing any trips.
Well, we've got the proposal in for the ARIA funding for Greenland, so I would imagine that might be the next one when that's all. We're waiting to hear about the funding for that.
Fairly clear, thank you. And then the other question really was about balancing those two roles that you touched upon them, about given the significant investment that went into that vessel, how does NERC maximise its use, balancing the roles between supporting logistics and the conducting the marine research that you touched on?
I'll answer that one, or do you want to do that one? So everybody says, why don't you want two ships? Well, no, I don't want two ships. They're very expensive to run. And I would rather have one really good ship that does very good science. And it's a big ship, so it takes 60 scientists. And we can do far more better, high-quality science on that Sir David Attenborough than we could on the two smaller ships that took less scientists with old-fashioned facilities. But our programme was always one ship plus. And the plus is that if we need another ship to do some logistics support or to do some science support, we charter it for a short amount of time. So we're not paying for two ships, two fuel, two extra crews, they're very expensive to run, and that would be a real waste of money, to be honest. And so we are focusing on just taking the facilities that we need. So we've hired a ship jointly with the Germans and other nations this last season to do some cargo to our Halley station. So it's really about maximising the efficiency and maximising the funding on the ship.
Can I ask Dr. Williams, do you agree with that assessment? Is that could I ask your view?
Yes, certainly. We have increased the number of charter ships since we went down from two to one ship, and including aircraft as well to support with logistics as well, charter aircraft as well. And that flexibility it provides is both welcomed and more efficient, I would say. Just to say about prioritising use of the Sir David Attenborough, we've published the criteria that we use for prioritising its activity. They're overseen by a board I chair, Jane is on it, as well as members of the research community as well. So we're completely open and transparent about how we use the ship, how we prioritise it for logistics and research activity. And just to be careful that when we say logistics, a lot of that logistics is supporting terrestrial-based science as well. So it's still scientific activity. You have to be careful on that.
I can really hear how carefully you've analysed the value and the benefit. There is also an implied growth there, that growth of the research, and we're hearing about the growing demands. Do you think that will continue to sustain the sort of 1+ or 1++? Do you think that will sustain us going forwards? My question is, as you alluded, will we ever need to, or can we keep adding to the one?
What really, I think the limiting factor for science that we do is the funding. It's not about capabilities.
It's the revenue for the delivery.
But also, a lot of the work we've done, as we've mentioned before, is done in collaboration. So Antarctica is a big place. It's expensive to work. It's really difficult to work. It's remote. And so the best science is done in collaboration. So nearly all of the projects that we do with other nations. And that the whole structure of Antarctica, especially through the Antarctic Treaty, is set up for international collaborations. So there's a body called the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, which brings together all the 57 nations, or the ones that want to join, that work together, and they provide the structure for people to collaborate and work together. So it is a very collaborative environment. And there's very few programs that we do with that don't have international partners on them.
Thank you. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. That's a perfect bridge, actually, because it's on both funding and collaboration. So since we were talking about collaboration, Professor, could you perhaps walk us through some of the challenges that exist in ensuring effective?
So I think Iain mentioned about double jeopardy. So one of the things that we have to work hard to do is to work with nations to plan these collaborations so that we ensure that there are pots of funding available that are balanced about how we bring the research together, about timing of, even grant rounds and things like that. So there are the practical problems. But on the whole, we make them work. So I want to tell you about the biggest Antarctic programme that is ever going to happen. It's very exciting. It's called Antarctica in Sync, where there are 26 nations plus, because we're involved. And the plan is to really establish where is Antarctica now in terms of climate change. We all do our bits, but we're going to all work together in the Antarctic season 28-29. We'll all be around Antarctica with our icebreakers and working on projects on land as well in the stations, air and satellites. ESA's going to turn its satellites towards Antarctica so that we have the data from the satellites. And we're planning this now, and there'll be huge number of nations, huge number of research projects working around Antarctica at the same time, taking synchronous measurements so we can understand where the Antarctic nation is. We'll be collecting huge amounts of data that will be synthesized and presented for, as I said, modelling, forecasting and policy in International Polar Year, which is planned to be 2032-33, which is when there'll be a lot of focus on the poles as well. So keep a watch for Antarctica in Sync. It's a massive part of planning at the moment, but every nation in Antarctica will join in.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. It sounds like a sort of fantastic and very complicated piece of work. Are there any specific challenges in that project to sort of tease out that might be useful for us to know about?
Funding. How do we fund this? Yeah. So I'm working with NERC to understand how we can then make longer term funding, because a lot of the funding pockets at the moment are quite small, and we've had short term spending reviews at the moment, which are a bit of a challenge to plan ahead. So we really need to understand where the funding goes. We can do 5 years, but going longer than that would be much more helpful.
Okay, so my final question then, Chair, is for Dr. Williams, and is about the grant funding. So the grant funding levels of 4 to 5 million from NERC, are they sufficient to support these ambitious long-term projects?
Yeah, so a couple of comments on that. First of all, of course, the grant funding for Antarctic research doesn't include all the logistics that goes in to doing so. It doesn't sound very much if you think of the logistics, but that is all comes out separately from what is actually a budget that is separate to NERC's budget, called the Antarctic Logistics Antarctic Logistics. Infrastructure partition. I knew there was a P in it, which funds the infrastructures and the fuel for the ship and those sorts of things. So that enables the grant size to be comparable to another grant in another domain in environmental science. You did timeframes as well. Timeframes is a real balance for people like me. If you like, the longer term I commit to funding a long-term project reduces our flexibility into the future, because it just forward commits our budget. There will always be scientists talking to me saying, I've got new ideas, great new techniques and new challenges. So we have to balance that very carefully between long-term science long enough to make an impact, if you like, but also ensuring that we maintain flexibility to react, if you like, to the latest technologies, policy positions, and of course scientific investigations. The long-term, we find the longer-term funding at BAS enables that in a different way, and we provide longer-term funding for the British Antarctic Survey for them.
Can I ask one final question? Are there any changes to the funding mechanisms that you would really like to see that would really support your projects into the future?
I think we're always looking at our funding mechanisms to ensure that they are the best available to support the community that undertakes our research. We made some changes a couple of years ago around pushing the frontiers and exploring the frontiers to enable really new ideas to come into fund at a small level, but to really encourage some really innovative and exciting ideas. So we're continually flexing our models, if you like, to explore the best opportunities for science.
Thank you, Chair.
Finally and briefly, Barry Gardner.
Dame Jane, would it therefore be one of the recommendations that you would like to see this committee put forward in its report that government should actually permit that 5-10-year funding regime?
Yes, please. I think the Science Minister will say the same, because he understands that, you know, there is a challenge that Iain mentioned about committing for such a long time, but for big projects you really do need long-term.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I hesitate here, but at the beginning in your introduction, which was fantastic introduction, I think you said that Antarctica contained 90% of the fresh water, and it's 70, isn't it?
70% and 90% of the world's ice. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I know the two numbers, yes.
Just in case anybody's watching and got
that's right.
wrote into us. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Very briefly, Cameron Thomas.
I'm a scuba diver. I spent some time diving in the Indian Ocean, and I recall, I am trying to go as fast as I can, just how loud diesel-powered ships can be from a mile away. To your knowledge, what assessment's been made as to the impact of noise pollution as experienced by marine life, bipolar research and tourism?
So there have been quite a lot of research projects around the world on different areas on the noise from ships. So we've not done specifically on our ship, but there has been a lot of research on the impact particularly on whales and ocean animals. One of the things that we are doing, though, with our ship, partly because of the carbon footprint, to stop using so much fuel, is to try and use the ship, we call it as a mothership. So we'll in the old days we used to go like this to go collect data. So the idea now is that we will take the ship and we will not stop it, but we will position the ship in one position, and then from there we launch a lot of autonomous vehicles. So drones up in the air, we've got little sailboats that go along the surface that are directed by GPS. I can run one from my office from my iPhone, James, and but it collects data, and it can go for hundreds of kilometres just by wind power. And then we have autonomous vehicles that go, like marine robots that go in the ocean and use the buoyancy of the ocean to collect data. So use the ship less.
Thank you.
That's the way forward for science.
Thank you ever so much, Dr. Williams and Professor Francis, for your evidence. Very helpful. And thank you for helping us today. Order. Okay, well, thank you very much to our third panel of today, Jane Rumble, Minister Stephen Doughty and Minister Lord Vallance. Can I just ask you first to each introduce yourselves and what your role is, please, in terms of its relevance to the study that we're doing, starting with you, Ms Rumble.
Yes, hello, I'm Jane Rumble. I'm head of the Polar Regions Department in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office.
I'm Stephen Doughty, I'm Minister of State at the FCDO and with responsibility for the Polar Regions.
Patrick Vallance, I'm Minister for Science, Research and Innovation in DCIT, and obviously a lot of the research funding comes through that department.
Excellent. Well, starting with you if I can, Minister Vallance, does the government recognise, as we were hearing in the previous panel, that the impacts of climate change on Antarctica and therefore on the rest of the world are accelerating?
Absolutely. I think the Antarctic Peninsula is one of the fastest warming places in the Southern Hemisphere. We know that there have been extreme weather events in the Antarctic region, and that we can see the consequences of that on the ice shelves, on glaciers, on erosion of coastal ice, and the consequences that follow in terms of some of the effects on the biodiversity in the region as well.
And what are the government's assessment of the broader consequences, both to the region and globally, from what we are witnessing in Antarctica?
Well, globally, as the melting continues, if we had a big fracture of an ice shelf, West Antarctic ice shelf would be huge in terms of sea level rises. Thwaites Glacier would be big in terms of sea level rises. So we've got sea level rises. Even before that, the warming of the oceans is leading to a change in the circulatory patterns, which can be pretty important and have much bigger distant effects from Antarctica than the ones just around Antarctica itself. So these are things that are going to have global consequences, and under some models, actually, the sea level rises turn out to be higher in the UK than they do in other parts of the world because of the gravitational effect, depending on what happens to ice shelves. So this is a profound global issue.
And I mean, in terms of those UK consequences of those rising sea levels, I mean, what would they mean to coastal communities?
Well, it depends how far they go. I mean, clearly there are situations in which levels go very high, and that has very major consequences around the coast. At the moment, we're seeing sort of much more minor increases, but they're still having effects in terms of erosion and flooding and other consequences.
Yeah. Minister Doughty, if I could turn to you, we've heard obviously that sobering evidence. I don't know if you heard the previous panel that we had, but if not, I would definitely encourage you to see the evidence that we heard, which I'm sure has worried everyone. Does the UK government plan to push for stronger environmental protections within the Antarctic Treaty System to address the impacts of climate change within Antarctica's unique ecosystems and to ensure the longer-term sustainability of the region? And if so, what are those? What is it we're pushing for?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here today and take these issues extremely seriously, both in my own responsibilities, but also working across the government, particularly given the mission that the Prime Minister set out on climate change and on energy and on green transition and nature protection. Those are at the core of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office's missions, and also for the Foreign Secretary and myself, and particularly with that responsibility for the polar regions. This is an important part of our work, and it's just to say a little bit, one of the reasons why we're bringing together actually ministers from across government as part of a polar regions ministerial group as a new innovation to actually ensure that there's that coordination across teams, a range of interests, not only in the Antarctic but also in the Arctic, and we hope that provides an assurance to the committee of how seriously we take these issues. Obviously, climate change is a standing item for both the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings and indeed the CAMLA meetings, and there was a 2023 declaration on climate change at the Helsinki meeting, and we're very, very clear about the global implications of climate change and the need for urgent action to protect Antarctica, as Patrick's just set out very clearly. the consequences. Obviously, the protocol to the treaty itself establishes Antarctica as a natural reserve dedicated to peace and science, and also a comprehensive framework for the protection of the Antarctic environment, and that means that activities in Antarctica can be pre-planned, conducted with minimal environmental impact, and obviously there are additional things there in terms of mineral resources other than for scientific purposes. It also established a committee on environmental protection, which advises the ATCM meetings, and we've worked closely with others, and Jane's been key in that work. I'll bring her in to address the impacts of climate change, non-native species presence, and also we proposed the creation of visitor site guidelines, which make sure that protects the most popular tourist sites. So we're going to continue to advocate within the treaty system for dealing with the impacts of climate change, enhanced protection for climate vulnerable species, particularly you'll have heard the huge devastating consequences for emperor penguin colonies, I'm sure, and I'm sure that's been brought to the committee's attention before, but this is on every level. It's the species on land, it's the underwater species, krill, fish, others, and the impacts then on obviously wider ecosystems. And I would just say this is also part of a wider approach that we're taking in relation to our overseas territories more generally. And obviously we take our obligations to the British Antarctic Territory, South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, and indeed the Falkland Islands as adjacent, those very seriously. And I've been working closely with overseas territories leaders more generally on a series of initiatives around climate change and environmental conservation. But perhaps James say a little bit more about the involvement in the discussions in the treaty system.
Yeah, so you've covered it pretty comprehensively. The role of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting is to implement the treaty and its protocol on environmental protection. So it's looking very much at how do we manage Antarctica, how do we keep it safe in respect of Antarctica. There's also the separate question of kind of the science that's done in Antarctica is actually quite global in scale. So it's also making sure that we can facilitate that message about what's happening in Antarctica and what does it mean globally as a sort of secondary objective. So I think that's
very much. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Vallance, if I can come to you first. We heard from Dame Jane that thinking about the rate of change in the Antarctic has radically altered in the last 5 years. I think with Robert de Conte's paper from Amherst back in 22-21. That rethink about the impacts of climate change. We're talking, as Dame Jane said, 70% of the fresh water in the planet, 6 million cubic miles of ice. It's very difficult for people to get their heads round just what the implications of that melt could be. Can you lead us through what the latest thinking from the Intergovernmental Panel has been and how they've set out the different impacts that might come? You spoke about the impact in sea level rise, but the impacts that there might be at various threshold temperatures, and how the Intergovernmental Panel is now looking at that.
Well, this obviously goes beyond just the Antarctic. It's clearly a global issue for all sorts of reasons, and I think there is now
specifically with reference,
there is now I think a pretty wide consensus that 1.5 degrees is likely to be breached in the mid-2030s, and that the keeping it down below 2 is also at risk, and that at the end of the century it may be as high as 3 degrees. So there is a very clear understanding that this is headed in the wrong direction if nothing changes, and it's still technically feasible to keep below 1.5, but I think most people think that is extremely unlikely. The consequences of that are the ones that have been, I think, well articulated, and we know that above 2 we start to see very serious effects indeed, including the rise in sea levels, which I've mentioned, which could become catastrophic for some low-lying islands.
Well, actually, not just from some low-lying islands. We're talking, I mean, if all that ice went, we would be talking...
No, clearly, if all the... I meant 2 degrees centigrade. Yeah. I mean, if all the ice goes, then there is meters of rise. I mean, if the West Antarctic ice shelf goes, that's a huge increase, which has catastrophic effects in all sorts of places.
And the science that's been done in the past 5 years in the Antarctic has specifically shown, has it not, that things are happening much faster than we had previously thought?
Yes.
So take us through what the government's takeaway should be from that. If here we are making recommendations to government about this science, what should our key recommendation to the government be as a consequence of that?
I think it's very clear that whilst mitigation is essential, adaptation is also essential. And adaptation has been the poor cousin of mitigation for a long time, and it is now not responsible to ignore the needs of adaptation right the way around the world, and that requires much wider thinking around what is needed.
Thank you.
Everywhere.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to focus now on the effects of these changes on the southern oceans, and specifically on what is happening to the biodiversity in the southern oceans as a result of that accelerated rate of change?
Well, we're seeing a movement of krill further south. That's, of course, going to change patterns of the fish and the sea mammals around islands. They're seeing more whales off Antarctica as a result of that movement. So there's definitely a shift in the pattern of where fish are and where sea mammals are as well. That will continue, and not only do we see that change in pattern of the marine life, we're also seeing changes closer to shore because of the loss of sea ice around the edges of Antarctica. And we're seeing changes in the ability of the ocean to store CO2. So there's a rather dangerous sort of positive feedback mechanism where as the sea warms, less CO2 can be contained in the sea. Therefore, you get more CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So this is a really very serious situation where we're seeing this feedback loop.
And if I might add, I mean, when you look at, for example, the impact on emperor penguin colonies I mentioned earlier on, the low sea ice cover in 2022 resulted in the total breeding failure of 4 out of 5 of the emperor penguin colonies. So it's having a very, very direct and immediate impact on key species that we all want to see protected.
Yeah, and principally as a result of the fact that we're getting rain in the Antarctic desert, which we haven't previously had, which then it causes a problem.
I was in the Antarctic Peninsula in January 23 and it rained.
Yeah.
And that should not be happening.
Yeah. Minister Doughty, well, actually, one more thing, if I may, Minister Vallance. You spoke about the gravitational effects of the mass of ice being lost and the impact that would have. But the research from the University of Delft a few years ago now suggested that actually if you saw because this will happen obviously in tandem with what's going on in Greenland, and they were saying that actually the impacts around the UK coast would be to lower the sea level around the UK coast. So, and that's again because of the gravitational influence, because if you go from the Arabian Gulf through to Iceland, you're going up by about 80 metres. It's not distributed evenly around the planet because of that gravitational pull. So can you just source where
I was referring to the west, the ice shelf itself. Now, if that happened in isolation, then what I said becomes true, I think, that you get an effect where you have a bigger sea change rise than expected. But I'm not going to battle with the experts on this. It's not my area of expertise. And if you've had academics giving strong evidence to the contrary, I'm happy to bow to their knowledge on this.
No, I was just asking for the source of the research on the shelf.
I can get that to you because that comes from British Antarctic Survey, actually.
And the only thing I'd urge the committee to consider, as well as small island states around the world, and indeed the global sea rise and erosion effects globally, is of course in our British family we have a number of small island states. And I was just in the OTs in the Caribbean, speaking with them directly about what they were seeing in terms of sea level rise, changing weather patterns and erosion on them. And that's...
Look, sorry, Minister, that was absolutely understood. No, it was simply the comment that Minister Vallance made about the impact on the UK from the gravitational impact, which was countered by the University of Delft. Mr. Doughty, if I can ask you, the UK sees itself as a global leader on environmental issues. Apart from Resolution 5 back in 2019 on plastic waste, what specific legislative measures are we advocating now, and how will we put them into effect, given that the environmental protocol can't really be modified for another 24 years?
Specifically on plastics, or...?
No. What proposals do we have now? We put forward Resolution 5 on plastics. But, if we are taking a leadership role on environmental matters in the Antarctic, what are we putting forward, and how are we going to implement it? Because we've no means, effectively, of amending the protocol until 2048, because unanimity is unlikely to be forthcoming. I think I see Ms. Rumble's smiles sort of agrees with me on that.
I'll defer to Jane. She was in the conversation just a few weeks ago with Jane.
Yes, thank you. Well, firstly, the date of 2048 in respect to the protocol is simply a review mechanism. It's not necessarily instigating anything in particular. So if we wanted to have additional legislation, we would just simply need to get that agreed by consensus.
By consensus.
Yes, and in 2048, any modification to the protocol still requires a three-quarters majority, and that doesn't mean that you can amend the prohibition on commercial mining, because you can only amend that provision if you've already got in place a regime to govern commercial mining, and that in itself would need consensus. So the date is sort of slightly academic in respect of if we want to strengthen the protocol. We do that all of the time. A lot of it, to be fair, is done through guidelines, because it's quite hard to get agreement to new legislative instruments internationally at the moment. But most countries do follow guidelines, so we have quite comprehensive guidelines. And at the moment, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting has just agreed to commence negotiations on a new regulatory binding framework for tourism. And so quite a lot of the waste issues, they're either tourists really or the science. It's where most of the waste is coming from. So that will be picked up at that point. There's already quite strong provisions in the protocol anyway about tourism activity and dumping of waste and so on. So yes, we will be looking to amend that if we can.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. To Lord Vallance, what are the UK government's key priorities for Antarctic science, and how will those priorities align with the UK's efforts to address global challenges like climate change?
Well, there's an overarching aim, which is planetary sustainability relating to the polar regions. And clearly those things link to other work on climate change and adaptation as well. The bulk of the funding comes through NERC, and their priorities, to be more specific, are climate and climate change is one, glacial and cryospheric systems, including the question of loss of ice and the risk in the polar regions, and ocean circulation are the three major areas that they cover. But there are many other pots of funding coming through UKRI and others that cover other things as well. So there's work going on biodiversity. Most of the biodiversity work actually is marine biodiversity work. But if you take the facility itself, so you take the Rothera facility, it's used by other countries as well. So the Netherlands are there doing lots of work on land-based biodiversity loss there as well. So there's work going on beyond those three areas, including on sea level rise, as we've discussed, and indeed on space weather, because it's quite a good region from which to understand some of the effects of solar flares and space weather as well.
Okay. And how is the UK-led research informing international discussions on global climate change mitigation to ensure more protection for the continent?
Well, historically, the UK has been profoundly important, and the work in the Antarctic region has been crucial. It was the place that the hole in the ozone layer was first identified, and that led to the Montreal Agreement, which actually had a significant effect to reverse that hole. So historically we've been important, and if you look at the IPCC reports and ask what percentage of the citations in there are to UK funded research, is very high. So we remain influential, and obviously the chair of the IPCC at the moment is an eminent UK scientist. So the work that's done from the UK is highly influential. We have a disproportionately loud voice in this around the world. And the work that goes on through the British Antarctic Survey, and indeed the facilities it provides for others to come there, is influential, I think, everywhere.
Okay, no, good to hear. And a question to Mr. Doughty or Ms. Rumble. What assurances can the UK government provide regarding continued funding for the Blue Belt programme beyond 2025, and how will you be ensuring continued protection the marine environments around the British Antarctic Territory and other UK overseas territories?
We remain huge supporters of the Blue Belt programme, and indeed we discussed this at the Joint Ministerial Council with the Overseas Territories leaders just a few weeks ago, and we've been encouraging further sign-ups to those. I mean, obviously, as you know, all government spending is part of the spending review processes. It's not for me to sort of prejudge those at the moment, but what I will say is that marine conservation and the incredible work that's gone on in that scheme is something that we recognised previously. We want to continue, and we're working with partners across the overseas territories to make sure that work can continue, and that we're working and coordinating with others on that. And it's as crucial in the South Atlantic as it is in the Caribbean and in our other Atlantic territories as well. Indeed, I was with even the mayor of Pitcairn the other week and talking about the fact that the ocean area around Pitcairn is the size of France. Right, so these are hugely important issues, but I don't want to prejudge funding allocations.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you.
Pippa Halings, briefly.
Thank you very much. And sort of prior declaration, I was did a little bit of work supporting the Blue Belt programme in a prior life before becoming an MP. But just on that, I did ask a question earlier to Dame Frances, which is perhaps Jane can mention it, because we haven't mentioned marine protected areas. Mm-hmm. And so could you say, do we have sufficient research to be able to justify the creation of those, and what do you think now are the possibilities, given the tensions and consensus building approach, for the delivery of some of those marine protected areas, given our 30 by 30 ambitions as well?
Maybe if I say a little introduction, and James has been part of some of the important discussions on this. So obviously we secured agreement on the first Camla Marine Protected Area in 2009, and we supported the Ross Sea region MPA designation in 2016, and we've continued to advocate for a network of MPAs within the Camla Convention area as a whole. We are a co-proponent of 3 of the current MPA proposals, 2 in the Weddell Sea, 1 in East Antarctica, and we've also been active in the discussions about strengthening krill fishing measures and establishing MPAs in the Antarctic Peninsula. But MPAs are an important part of our collective effort, and obviously we're involved in discussions of them in many places around the world and globally. I actually used to work on a marine protected area declaration myself in Canada years ago as a young student doing marine ecology. So they can play a crucially important role in our efforts. But perhaps Jane, say a little bit about the current discussions on this.
Yeah, so the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, CAMLR, sets out a framework for the Southern Ocean, and it includes quite a lot of measures that have already been agreed by consensus, which include areas that are currently you're able to fish and areas which are currently closed. And if you want to try to do fishing in a closed area, then you would need to submit a research proposal, which then comes to the Commission. In many areas, that has to be agreed by consensus. So CAMLR already provides a very comprehensive framework. So although it's incredibly frustrating at the moment that we can't move that framework on, we wouldn't want to kind of suggest that we want to get rid of it, because it already provides this kind of very good framework. Within the Southern Ocean, the main things that we're looking at are kind of protection of climate change and to improve resilience, and then managing tourism and fishing. So we don't have like all of the pressures that you would have around the UK on the marine environment. So it's the sort of the threat analysis. I don't want to sound like I'm arguing against MPAs, but the threat is not as immediate as it might be in other areas, and we do have mechanisms to prevent unrestricted fishing. However, there is extremely good evidence that suggests that large-scale marine protected areas do provide this better resilience, and there's a lot of kind of reasons why you want to protect around Antarctica, from unique benthic forum with fish nests, all sorts of things. So this is why the UK advocates very strongly for marine protected areas, and we would like to have them enshrined and established in this kind of consensus mechanism. But we've also made very clear in our interventions at Camelot to Russia and China that we are not going to be in a position to agree to any kind of development of fishery in areas that we think are worthy of protection. So there is sort of a we need to somehow break the impasse so we can move on, but there are mechanisms by which we can enact marine protection. Although we would like to see it strengthened, we can have some marine protection, and that's what we're pursuing. And the bottom line, more generally, we are a fishing and a conservation nation, and the key thing is to be led by the science, and be led by the data, and that's why we put so much effort into that, and that's what should guide our approach going forward, and will guide our approach engaging with others too.
Thank you. Ellie Chowns.
Thank you. Question to Lord Vallance about government support for UK science in Antarctica. So the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernisation Programme is valued, I think, at £670 million. Could you comment on how the government is evaluating the impact and effectiveness of that investment, both in terms of advancing scientific understanding and also enhancing our logistical capabilities in Antarctica?
Yes, so we're phase 2 at the moment, and there's a phase 3 to come. Phase 1 was the ship and the facilities to enable the ship to be able to dock in the right places. Phase 2 related to the new facilities at Rother in particular, but in other areas as well. And that is a really, really important, both of those are really important. The ship has allowed research to take place that wouldn't have been possible before. It's allowed multiple programs of research to go on at the same time, which is important because in the past it was possible to do one thing and then you had to stop and then somebody else had to come and do another one. So now you can have multiple experiments and multiple teams there working together. And the new centre that's opening at Rotherham, I think, will provide state-of-the-art laboratory facilities, which it urgently needs, actually, in order to be able to do the type of work that's now possible. So those, I think, are progressing well. We can see the impact of the ships already. We can't yet see the impact of the new facilities because they're not yet open, but they will be shortly. And then there's a third phase, which also includes looking at some of the things like the support from the aircraft and so on as well with that. We have, I think, a very good set of facilities in the Antarctic. It's a real research base. Some of the research bases there are not doing real cutting-edge research. They are in Antarctica, and as I said, it's not just the British Antarctic Survey team, it's academics who are able to use that and fly in and do specific projects, and it's other countries that are using that facility as well. So I think this is an important modernisation programme and one that will stand us in very good stead for the future.
Thank you. Can I just press you gently to elaborate a bit more on the government's process for evaluating that impact? You were saying we can see the impact already of the ship. Yeah. We've heard stories of that already, but what is the formal process for evaluating such a significant investment?
There'll be an appraisal through NERC and through the assessment of what research they can fund, and there'll be an appraisal of the overall costs and the impact on the running, including the environmental impact of what's going on there. But I don't have the precise programme of how that evaluation works.
Okay. Personally, I'd be quite interested
in we'll find
a written response on the format and time frame for that. Regarding NERC,
Do you know, Jane?
We've heard in the previous session about the limitations of NERC funding, and I know the previous committee heard about that in terms of NERC's ability to kind of fund the long-term programmes, research programmes that are needed, particularly given, the significance of the research that we've heard about here. So can I ask, does the government plan to ensure that larger scale, long-term projects can receive adequate financial support, to increase the positive impact of the capital investment that we've put in? We need to be able to do the long-term funding for the scientists to do the work over multi-year programmes, surely.
Well, that's why the government has said that we will look at 10-year funding programmes for certain types of activities, not for everything, for certain types of activities, because you do need that long-term view. I will say, though, that although it's true that, like our own budgets, with the Treasury giving annual budgets, we plan far longer than that, of course. And so NERC does actually have very long-term programmes. BAS gets its funding every year, and so although it's an annual funding cycle, it doesn't assume that we're going to stop it next year. And indeed, if you look at UKRI funding, one of the reasons that UKRI is difficult to make changes in stream is because the programmes that are funded go well beyond the actual funding allocation to UKRI. So there are long-term programmes. It's understood they need to be long-term, but we do want to look and see whether in some cases getting an agreed 10-year funding would give a greater stability to do that. I will, though, add one risk, which is the danger of putting 10-year funding cycles in place is, of course, you can't predict what the need's going to be, and as long as that is a floor and not a ceiling, it's okay.
Thank you. Regarding the Sir David Attenborough, the RS Sir David Attenborough, can you comment on how the UK government plans to optimise its use? Really significant investment, a significant ship. Bearing in mind its kind of different roles in supporting scientific research, logistical support and so on. And would you consider investing in an additional icebreaker? We've heard comments from previous panels on that. I'd just like to invite the government's view on your thoughts on proposals for a second similar ship.
There are no proposals for a second ship. And I think if you look at what other countries are doing, many of them are moving to a single ship model. I think the advantages of having one really good ship are being seen now rather than two that were not able to do some of the things that needed to be done. And it does mean there's a logistics challenge in terms of what's done when. And there are some quite sophisticated ways being looked at as to how to model that use in order to optimise the efficiency. But I think the initial reactions to what's been seen so far is far more science can be done in a well-equipped ship of the type that the Sir David Attenborough is than was ever done with two ships.
I think it's worth also pointing out, of course, that multiple projects can go on at any one time on David Attenborough, right? It's an incredible facility, first-class research ship, incredible crews. I had the pleasure of meeting some of them in the Arctic, actually, a few months back, and when they'd actually been doing their work around Greenland as well. So, of course, we must recognise they're doing work at both poles as well and doing it very well and are able to do multiple projects simultaneously.
Thank you. The Minister has kindly pointed out to me that actually the answer to your previous question about assessment is there are a series of gateway reviews that are planned for all of the spend, but I don't have the details of exactly what's in each of those. I can also, if I can answer the earlier question about the gravitational effect, it's the Met Office Hadley Centre. That's where that came from.
Thank you very much. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Doughty, given the state of international relations, we've recently just heard from Jane about frustrations and impasse, and evidence heard from the previous committee during their inquiry raised substantial concerns around the management of fisheries in Antarctica. Reports from the 43rd annual meeting of CAMLAR criticised a substantial step backwards on krill fishing management. Given all of that, how is the UK government addressing obstruction in setting fishery catch limits based on scientific data, and how is the UK working to ensure the sustainability of fishing practices in the Southern Ocean?
I think if it's helpful, just to say a little bit about the sort of wider geopolitics and what's going in here. I mean, obviously the treaty itself has been in force for 65 years. It's often described as one of the most effective international treaties. aim of conflict prevention, peace in Antarctica, and it's kept Antarctica as the only continent, the actual continent itself, never to have seen military conflict. And obviously the Antarctic Treaty, CAMLA, the Environmental Protocol, very, very strong international foundations to protect and conserve the continent. But the reality is that where you might have once seen Antarctic exceptionalism before, that's no longer accurate. We see Russia and China prosecuting their wider aims and their behaviour in those environments, and particularly in some of the forums, and obviously we see that replicated in other areas, of course, including at the opposite end in terms of the Arctic Council as well. So, that's a wider geopolitical shift that you see, and Russia and China in particular consider that the treaty system's tipping far towards environmental protection, and they're using their rights to utilise Antarctica in respect of fishing and tourism and so on. So there is a wider context there. In terms of the specific discussions that went on at the recent CAMLA, I'll defer to Jane because she was there. But there was some difficult behaviour, and I'll let Jane provide some further detail on that.
So one of the key points that we were trying to negotiate in October was how to take the current precautionary trigger level of krill, which is a figure that is established well below what would be the precautionary catch limit that CAMLA might set. So krill is already kind of capped. That cannot be changed without consensus. So we have a sort of first safeguard. But that figure was subdivided into 4 different locations around the Antarctic Peninsula and up to South Georgia. And the scientists have been working on how you might increase the amount that you could take around the Antarctic Peninsula, which is one of the places that a lot more krill has moved into, in a way that doesn't concentrate the catch such that you could have a local depletion effect on penguins and seals. That science advice wasn't entirely definitive. It's not a question that you can have a particular number to, so there were a range of ideas coming forward. China wanted, of course, the most maximalist approach to the krill number. They wanted it immediately, and they weren't prepared to discuss any kind of marine protection as a safeguard around this. So we didn't get agreement on how to change it. But unlike the previous 3 years where we had rolled over the original kind of sort of best guess, really, at what would be a precautionary limit, China blocked the rollover of that, subsequently supported by Russia, which means that all of the catch can now, in theory, be taken around the Antarctic Peninsula. So there is a risk that you could have an over-concentration of catch. It's frustrating because CAMLA would normally take a precautionary approach, but at the moment, the krill fleet combined isn't getting towards that number. So the actual amount of krill that's taken is a bit lower. 70% of the catch, certainly around South Georgia, is taken by Norway. Norway is taking a much more forward-leaning approach to this. Most of the operators who engage in krill fishing are members of the Association of Responsible Krill Operators, and they made a statement that they would stick to having buffer zones so they wouldn't catch the krill directly against the penguin colony. So it was a very poor outcome from a CAMLA perspective. From a conservation perspective, it's worrying, but it's not an immediate catastrophe, but it could be. So we need very quickly to get back to the negotiations, and we hope that China and Russia will come with a more forward-leaning approach, because I suspect some of the environmental groups will be starting to question whether or not krill is a sustainable catch. And if it isn't, then it won't get Marine Stewardship Council accreditation, and it will be difficult to sell it into market. So there are pressures to try to resolve this, and I hope that we will be able to resolve it in the near future.
And I should point out, we've taken over the chairship of CAMLA now, and we've nominated Robbie Bullock as chair of the commission, and he's the incoming FCDO director of the Overseas Territories and Polar from April. So obviously he's going to try and work in that role with all the parties to try and find consensus on the conservation measures in particular.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so given that you've just talked to us there about a situation in which consensus hasn't been possible and which you haven't been able to find an agreement, and the risks that is raising, what specific actions can or is the FCDO taking to try and move beyond that and try and create a way around some of these geopolitical challenges?
Look, we're always willing to try and find ways through on these crucial matters, and that's particularly in our approach with China. The Foreign Secretary set out very clearly about where we need to cooperate with China on issues relating to climate and conservation and other matters. Obviously, it's quite a a different circumstance in relation to Russia, and unfortunately we see this behaviour in multiple international fora. But what I would say is there are of course examples where there are significant difficulties and differences. I'll just point to the recent South Atlantic Cooperation Agreement we were able to agree with Argentina, where we've agreed for data sharing on fisheries science, in particular in the South Atlantic, which obviously interact in terms of the ecosystems where previously that wasn't happening, and having met fishery scientists in the Falklands a couple of years ago and seeing how important that would have been to their work, and they were sort of operating a little bit in the dark. Even when you have difficulties and challenges in a relationship, there are ways of finding ways forward, and we always seek to try and do that.
So you're confident that progress is still possible?
I'm not confident. I must say progress is possible, but it very much depends on the circumstances. And obviously, Russia's disregard for the international rules-based order and system at the moment is apparent for all to see, and that is manifest in multiple occasions, not just in its barbarous war in Ukraine, but it's in its behaviour in a whole series of institutions, including, of course, at the United Nations Security Council.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. And Alison Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel. Just following on, Minister, from the geopolitical situation and the Antarctic treaty system, can I ask you how the UK will be working to ensure that the Antarctic treaty system continues to protect the continent's unique environment, as well as maintaining its status as a region dedicated to peace and scientific research?
I mean, I said a little bit before about our objectives for the treaty system in terms of overall in relation to the environment and some of the protocols and ways that works. But I would say a little bit about another area which, of course, is hugely relevant, which is about mineral extraction. It's obviously a concern for many people, quite rightly. And the environmental protocol includes a prohibition on commercial mineral extraction, which of course doesn't expire. It can be amended by a 3/4 majority rather than consensus. But the minerals prohibition could only be amended, for example, if there was already in place a binding legal regime on extraction, which would itself require consensus and ratification by all the parties. So we know there's often some speculation around this, but we don't believe currently that there's any clear evidence that any party is going as far as to directly get the evidence for commercial mineral deposits. But we're going to, obviously, whether it's in the fisheries conservation, whether it's on minerals, whether it's on the cooperation on the science, there are a whole series of ways which we're going to continue to use the treaty and its bodies. And great to have Jane and Robbie coming in as well, representing us in many of those forums and fighting the corner for the type of Antarctica that we all want to see, which is one that's sustainable, secure, safe, and treasured for all of humanity.
Thank you very much, Minister. The previous committee heard concerns about Russia's activities in Antarctica. What is the government's assessment of the activities of the Russian ship Academic Karpinski? Has the government had assurances that these activities are focused on scientific research? And is there evidence that there are any other objectives, such as resource prospecting?
So you may be referring to some of the media speculation I was responding to earlier, and rather than commenting on an individual vessel, what I would just say is there's no clear evidence that Russia's undertaking any more than geophysical mapping of the ocean floor around Antarctica, and obviously mapping would provide potential location of hydrocarbons and other minerals, but of course if you were to verify those, you have to undertake further activity, seismic surveys, drilling, and so on. And we haven't seen any evidence of that. And obviously, the reality is the environment is an extremely environmentally challenging place for commercial mining or hydrocarbon exploitation. So, exploitation would be vastly more expensive probably than anywhere else in the world. And fundamentally, all the treaty parties, gave those commitments in Helsinki in 2023 on this. But obviously, like everything, we keep these things closely under review, is what I would say.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
I mean, on the question of Russia, What assessment have we made about what their view is on climate change? And I mean, are there reasons to believe that they may get some beneficial consequences from it? Obviously, a lot of Russia is extremely cold and not particularly productive. Have we made any assessment as to whether they're actually as committed to this fight as much of the rest of the West is?
I mean, ultimately, I don't have a particular insight into what's going on inside the Kremlin and their policies on climate change. Obviously, Russia remains a major hydrocarbon energy producer. Equally, obviously, a lot of the money raised from that is going in to fund their war in Ukraine, and it's why we've been taking very substantial actions, for example, on the shadow fleet, to stop Russian shadow activities going on in terms of energy exploitation. And it should be pointed out that those aren't not just because of the money and where it's flowing and what that's supporting, but also actually because of the environmental consequences of some of those shadow fleet vessels that are operating around the world and the risks that come from those. So there are a whole series of measures that we're taking, but I don't have a particular insight into Russian views on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, we heard from Mr. Gray in the first panel that he feels, given the evidence that we've heard, that the profile of Antarctica is lower than it should be in the public mind, in our political discourse. Obviously, I'm expecting global coverage of this committee, but it's always possible we won't get it. Do you think that we are taking this seriously enough as a society?
I mean, on that point, I completely agree. I think the Antarctic and indeed the Arctic need to have far more attention in our minds. Not only for the devastating potential shifts and loss of habitat biodiversity, the sea level rise risks, the wider feedback loop risks within the global environment and climate and the oceans itself, and of course our atmosphere. Those should deeply worry us, and the Arctic and the Antarctic are at the heart of those stories. But I absolutely see them both also as areas where there is increased geopolitical competition, and therefore we need to be protecting our interests and those of allies and those who believe in a multilateral rules-based order, of course, which the Antarctic Treaty has always been a very clear example of a great example of that and what it's achieved. And when we would obviously stand strongly against any attempts to weaken or undermine that system and its protections. So I do hope that more attention is paid. It's one of the reasons why I've taken such an interest in these since becoming a minister, why we're convening the group of ministers across government to look at these issues and the wide range of interests and how those are joined up, how we can better cooperate with other allies and partners. I was speaking with Lord Coker from the Ministry of Defence, who I think was in Chile just a little while ago, speaking with partners there in relation to Antarctic science and security issues in the South Atlantic. And I think I was the first minister in 10 years to attend the Arctic Circle Assembly just a few months ago and to meet with key partners there. There were others very much on display there in terms of their presence, and it's crucial that the United Kingdom is part of those discussions, not only because of our incredible history, our expertise, our scientists. Patrick was already speaking about the high profile we have in the scientific research. It's absolutely crucial we maintain that, but also because of those wider equities and interests that we have in both regions.
I mean, given what we've heard about how much deterioration there's been in the last 2 years, and absolutely appreciate and welcome, this cross-departmental working and all of that you've just referred to. But are we really doing enough? I mean, preserving the existing treaty is preserving a path to failure. That's what we're hearing. What we need is active improvements in the situation rather than simply to not make the existing protections worse. So do you think we, as in sort of the global society and the UK government, are doing enough?
And I probably wouldn't agree with the characterisation of the treaty in that respect. We're committed to it, and we're committed to making it a success. We also deal with a very complex and contested world at the moment, and we could fire off criticisms of all sorts of other multilateral agreements and bodies, but they're the agreements that we have. This government is absolutely categorically committed to the multilateral system, rules-based order, international law, and to working with our partners to protect that system and the values and principles that it represents. So this is a writ large commitment for this government. It's why we put so much focus and investment into it. It's why we take the positions that we do and the investment that we do in the systems. Can there be additional things done on top? Well, absolutely, there are always additional measures that we can take, and some of those we can do unilaterally, some of those we can do with partners and allies, and we will continue to explore opportunities to achieve those goals, particularly in Antarctica in relation to its peacefulness, its protection, and its place as a treasure for humanity.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I wasn't saying that the treaty itself was a failure. I'm saying we're hearing that, the consequences to the Antarctic and then beyond that to the world we are on a path to failure. We need improvement. That's the point I was trying to make.
Absolutely, Chair. And on that, we are well aware of the risks and the threats, and that's why we're taking many of the actions that we are, and whether that's the investment in the science, the investment in our facilities and resources, the investment in the diplomacy around this. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I've been trying to build links with some of our partners internationally. I spent a lot of time with my Norwegian counterpart, Maria Vartaresian, and we spent time up in Tromsø recently and speaking about the work on Svalbard, also speaking about the Antarctic and our cooperation there. And it's very clear that we have got to be working with like-minded partners like Norway and others to ensure that we see progress in all these areas.
Mr. Vallance, I mean, from your perspective, as scientific advisor to government coming out of the budget and hearing the evidence we see here, what do you sort of think the UK, what will you be saying in those cross-departmental discussions about what the UK government should actually be doing in excess of what we've already done, if you like?
Well, just to make sure the record's clear, I'm not the scientific advisor to the government anymore. I'm the science minister, which is different. There is a very competent scientific advisor to Angela McLean.
He's the boss now.
Well, I will make the case, as I would always do, that where there is opportunity for science funding that will make a difference, we should prioritise it because it's important, and this is important, and of course there are other areas as well, but this has been a long-standing strength of the UK. I'll give you an example. I was actually visiting the University of Bern on Monday and looking at some of their work on ice core sampling, where you can go back to 800,000 years of CO2 content. They're now trying to go down to 1.5 million years. They'll know at the end of this week whether they've got ice from 1.5 million. And of course, the analysis of that, some of that's going to be undertaken in the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge. So this is a global scientific effort which requires teams in every country. We need to make sure our team is as strong as it can be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much to the three of you. Excellent evidence. We very much appreciate your time and your contributions today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Order.